Friedrich Weber had never heard music like this, disorderly, chaotic, passionate. July 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The American POW camp's canteen had a radio, and in the evenings it played jazz. When Friedrich first heard it, he hated it. In Nazi Germany, jazz was Entartete music, degenerate music, banned by law. Negro music, Jewish music, enemy of culture, the propaganda had said. But every evening he returned to that radio. Because jazz did something to Friedrich. It made him feel something he hadn't felt in 12 years. Freedom. The trumpet screamed, but no one silenced it. The drums beat irregularly, but no one said wrong. The piano broke rules, but no one punished it. In this music, there was no dictator, only musicians. And one night, Friedrich secretly found an old trumpet, went to an unused barracks, and played his first note. It was a terrible sound, amateur, shaky, embarrassing, but it was free. And when American Guard Corporal James Carter heard him, he didn't punish him. Instead, he said, "Want to learn how to play?" In that moment, Friedrich understood. Forbidden music wasn't just music, it was a way of thinking. And that way of thinking would change his life. Friedrich had grown up in Munich in a house where music meant Wagner and Beethoven, classical German composers whose works celebrated order, discipline, and national pride. His father, a stern music teacher at the conservatory, had trained him on trumpet from age 8. Proper embouchure, correct breath control, perfect adherence to the written score. Music is mathematics, his father would say. Each note has its place. Deviation is error. By the time Friedrich was 16, he could play any march, any classical piece, with mechanical precision. But he'd never improvised, never deviated from the score, never played anything that wasn't written down and approved. Then came 1933, and the music itself became political. The Nazi regime declared war on degenerate art, modern paintings, avant-garde literature, and especially jazz. Radio broadcasts were monitored. Concerts were censored. Playing or even listening to jazz could result in arrest. Friedrich's father had approved. That Negro noise has no place in German culture. It's primitive, unstructured, a corruption of true musical art. Friedrich had believed him. Why wouldn't he? His entire world said jazz was inferior, dangerous, un-German. So when he heard swing records smuggled from America, he dismissed them as chaotic garbage. No melody, no structure, just noise. The war had consumed everything after that. Friedrich was conscripted in 1941, served as a communications officer, and was captured in France during the Normandy aftermath. He'd expected American captivity to be brutal. The propaganda had been clear about that. Instead, he found Camp Hearn, where the greatest shock wasn't the treatment, but the music. The camp held about 5,000 German POWs, mostly young men who'd been foot soldiers rather than ideological true believers. They worked on Texas cotton farms during the day, earned small wages, and had surprisingly decent conditions. The Americans followed Geneva Convention protocols strictly, but it was the evening radio broadcast that disrupted everything Friedrich thought he knew about American culture. The canteen, a large room with tables and chairs where prisoners could spend leisure time, had one radio. American guards controlled it, switching between news broadcasts and music. And the music was almost always jazz. Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Benny Goodman, Louis Armstrong. Most German prisoners ignored it or complained about the noise. Some found it offensive, evidence of American cultural bankruptcy. But Friedrich couldn't stop listening. Despite himself, despite 12 years of conditioning that this music was degenerate, he was fascinated. There was something in the trumpet solos, the way they bent notes, slid between pitches, took familiar melodies and transformed them into something entirely new. It was wrong by every standard he'd been taught, and yet it felt more alive than anything he'd played in his regimented military band. The turning point came on a humid July evening. A Louis Armstrong recording played, West End Blues. The opening trumpet cadenza was unlike anything Friedrich had ever heard. Pure improvisation, starting with a held high note, and cascading down through complex runs that seemed impossible to execute. Friedrich sat transfixed. The technique was extraordinary, better than most classical trumpeters he'd studied under. But the feeling was different. Armstrong wasn't trying to prove technical mastery. He was expressing something, joy, pain, life itself, through sound. When the song ended, Friedrich realized his hands were shaking, not from fear or anger, but from recognition. This was what music could be when it wasn't controlled, when it wasn't forced into rigid structures. This was music as freedom. Corporal James Carter noticed Friedrich's reaction. Carter was a tall black man from New Orleans who'd grown up surrounded by jazz and now worked as a guard more out of patriotic duty than military ambition. He'd seen other German prisoners react to the music, usually with disdain or confusion. But Friedrich's expression was different. It looked like hunger. "You play?" Carter asked in basic German. Friedrich hesitated. Admitting musical interest felt like betrayal. But he nodded. "Trumpet. In Germany. Military band." "Military band." Carter smiled. "So you can read music. Follow orders. Play what you're told." "Yes." "That ain't jazz." Carter leaned against the wall. "Jazz is when you stop following and start listening. To yourself. To the other musicians. To what wants to come out." Friedrich didn't fully understand the English, but he grasped the concept. And it terrified him. Playing without a score? Without conductor? Without rules? That was chaos. That was exactly what his father had warned against. But he couldn't stop thinking about it. Over the following weeks, Friedrich became a fixture near the radio during evening broadcasts. He started recognizing musicians by their style. Armstrong's gravelly voice and brilliant trumpet. Ellington's sophisticated orchestrations. Goodman's clarinet that could swing and soar. Each had a distinct voice, a personality that came through the instrument. One evening, Carter approached him with something wrapped in cloth. "Found this in storage. Thought you might want it." Friedrich unwrapped it carefully. An old trumpet, dented, tarnished, but functional. His hands remembered the weight immediately. He hadn't held an instrument since before his capture. "Is allowed?" Friedrich asked, uncertain. "For practicing, yeah? Just don't bother anybody. There's an empty barracks on the east end. You can use it." That night, Friedrich took the trumpet to the abandoned building. It was just 4 walls and a roof, empty except for dust and Texas heat. He lifted the instrument to his lips and played a scale, then a simple melody from Brahms. His muscle memory was still there, though his embouchure was weaker after months without practice. Then he tried something terrifying. He attempted to play the opening cadenza from West End Blues. Not from memory. He couldn't remember the exact notes. But the feeling of it, the arc, the emotion, it was a disaster. He fumbled the notes, lost his breath, sounded like a dying animal. But in that failure, something shifted. For the first time in his life, he played something that wasn't written down. Something that came from inside rather than outside. He was attempting the passage again when footsteps approached. Friedrich's stomach dropped. He'd been caught making terrible noise, disturbing the peace. But it was just Carter, carrying a small stool. "That was rough," Carter said, sitting down. "But I heard what you were trying to do. Let me show you something." For the next hour, Carter gave Friedrich his first real jazz lesson. Not from a book, not from sheet music. Just by demonstration and correction. "You're thinking too much," Carter said after Friedrich's 5th attempt at a simple, improvised line. "Stop trying to find the right notes. There are no right notes. Just notes that feel true. But how I know which notes feel true? You listen. Not with your head. With your gut." Carter played a short phrase on his own trumpet. He'd brought his personal instrument. "Feel that? That's a question. Now answer it." Friedrich tried. His response was hesitant, uncertain. But it was his response. Not Brahms. Not Wagner. His. "There," Carter said, grinning. "That's jazz. You just had a conversation with yourself through music. Keep doing that." Over the following months, their evening sessions became routine. Carter would play a phrase. Friedrich would respond. Sometimes they'd play together, Carter leading while Friedrich tried to follow and anticipate. Other prisoners started gathering to listen. Some curious, some appreciative, some still convinced it was cultural corruption. "How can you listen to this?" Klaus Richter, a hardline Nazi sympathizer, demanded one evening. "It's Negro noise. Primitive. Beneath German dignity. Have you tried playing it?" Friedrich asked. "I wouldn't soil myself." "Then you don't understand it." Friedrich was surprised by his own boldness. This music requires incredible skill, technical mastery, but also something more, the ability to create in the moment, to respond. To communicate without words. That's not primitive. That's sophisticated in a way our regimented marches never were. Klaus spat on the ground and walked away. But several other prisoners stayed, listening with new attention. One of them, Otto Schmidt, approached afterward. I played piano, Otto said quietly. Before the war. Classical training. But I always wondered. He trailed off, looking at the trumpet in Friedrich's hands. Could you teach me what you're learning? By September, they'd formed a small group. Friedrich on trumpet, Otto on a donated upright piano that was barely in tune, and Hans Becker on drums made from whatever they could find, empty barrels, wooden boxes, metal scraps. They were terrible at first, but they practiced. Carter brought them recordings, used records he bought from pawn shops in nearby Bryan. They'd listen to arrangements, try to pick out the parts, figure out how the musicians interacted. It was like learning a new language by immersion. The breakthrough came with a song called Take the A Train. The melody was catchy, the structure clear enough to follow. After 2 weeks of practice, they managed to play through it without completely falling apart. When they performed it at the weekly camp talent show, a regular event organized to maintain morale, the response was mixed. Some prisoners applauded. Others walked out in disgust. But Colonel Winters, the camp commander, nodded approvingly. Not bad, he told Friedrich afterward. Rough around the edges, but you're getting the feeling of it. Music without borders. That's something we need more of. The camp's small jazz group became both celebrated and controversial. To some prisoners, it represented adaptation and cultural exchange. To others, it was collaboration with the enemy, acceptance of inferior American culture. The divide mirrored larger splits in the camp between pragmatists who'd accepted Germany's likely defeat and true believers who still thought victory possible. Friedrich found himself in the strange position of defending American music to fellow Germans while being mentored by a Black American guard who saw him as a student rather than an enemy. You know what jazz is really about? Carter said one evening as they practiced. It's about taking the worst situation, slavery, poverty, discrimination, and making something beautiful anyway. It's about finding freedom inside yourself when the world denies it outside. Friedrich understood in a way he hadn't before. He was a prisoner of war, but when he played jazz, he wasn't imprisoned. He was free to create, to express, to be more than a defeated soldier waiting for the war to end. By December 1944, as news from Europe grew increasingly grim for Germany, Friedrich was playing well enough to improvise actual solos. Not sophisticated ones. He was still learning the vocabulary of jazz. But real improvisation, responding to what Otto played on piano, creating melodies that hadn't existed before. One evening, Carter brought an unexpected gift, a book on music theory as it applied to jazz. Chord progressions, scale choices, the structure that underlay the apparent chaos. Friedrich devoured it, finally understanding the mathematics his father would have recognized, but mathematics in service of expression rather than rigid compliance. Jazz has rules, Carter explained, but they're suggestions, not orders. You learn them so you can break them intelligently. That's the difference from classical music. You're expected to find your own voice, not just reproduce someone else's. Find your own voice. The concept was revolutionary for someone raised in a culture that valued conformity and collective identity over individualism. But here, in a Texas POW camp, playing forbidden music with an enemy guard as his teacher, Friedrich was discovering who he was beneath the uniform and propaganda. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The camp radio broadcast the news, and most prisoners reacted with stunned silence. Germany had surrendered, unconditionally. Everything they'd fought for was lost. But Friedrich felt something unexpected, relief. The war was over. He'd survived, and he had something to return home with, not victory or honor, but a skill, a passion, a way of thinking about the world that was entirely his own. Repatriation took months. By the time Friedrich boarded a ship back to Europe in November 1945, he'd improved dramatically. The camp's small jazz group had become good enough to play regular performances. They'd even recorded a few songs on a wire recorder Colonel Winters had procured. Before leaving, Friedrich found Carter one last time. "I want to thank you," he said in much improved English. "You taught me more than music." Carter handed him something wrapped in newspaper. your trumpet. Take it with you. And this dash, a small notebook filled with chord progressions, song ideas, and personal notes Carter had written. Keep playing. Doesn't matter where you are or what happens next. Music like this, it reminds us we're human, not just soldiers or prisoners or whatever labels people stick on us. Friedrich clutched the trumpet like it was made of gold. What I do with this? In Germany, whatever feels true. Maybe teach others. Maybe just play for yourself. But don't let anyone tell you it's wrong or degenerate. Music that makes people feel alive and free can't be wrong. They shook hands, former enemy and student, guard and prisoner, Black American and German soldier, connected by music that had crossed every boundary that war created. 10 years later, Friedrich stood in a basement club in Munich, his trumpet warm in his hands. The sign outside said "Blue Note" in English and German. The club was packed, Germans, Americans, French, all mixed together, drawn by the music drifting up from below. His band, piano, bass, drums, and Friedrich's trumpet, launched into "Take the A Train," the song he'd first learned in a Texas POW camp, the melody that had taught him what freedom sounded like. The crowd responded immediately. Some danced, some just listened, swaying slightly. A few older Germans frowned. They still remembered when this music was forbidden. But most people just enjoyed it, responding to the joy and energy that jazz communicated across all languages. During his solo, Friedrich closed his eyes and thought about Carter, about those evening sessions in an abandoned barracks, about the moment he'd realized that music could be a bridge between worlds, a language that spoke to something universal in human experience. The note he held wasn't perfect. He bent it slightly, let it waver, then resolved it in a way that felt emotionally right even if it violated classical technique. The crowd responded with appreciation. They could hear what he was expressing, the complexity of being German in the aftermath of war, the gratitude for survival, the hope that culture could rebuild what politics had destroyed. After the set, a young German musician approached him. "Herr Weber, I've heard you studied in America. Can you teach me? I want to learn to play like that." Friedrich smiled, remembering his own journey from rigid military marches to jazz improvisation. "I can teach you the basics. But the most important thing you need to learn is that jazz isn't just about notes. It's about listening to yourself, to others, to what wants to be expressed. Can you do that? I'll try. Then come back tomorrow. Bring your instrument. And prepare to forget some of what you've learned about proper music. Because jazz starts where the rules end." That evening, as Friedrich locked up the club, he paused to look at a photograph on the wall. It showed him and Carter standing together in Camp Hearn, both holding trumpets. A captured moment between men who should have been enemies but became brothers through music. The photograph reminded him of what jazz had taught him. That culture wasn't fixed or pure, but fluid and mixed. That the most vibrant art came from cross-pollination, from taking influences and transforming them into something new. That labels like German or American, white or black, mattered far less than the shared human impulse to create beauty from chaos. Germany was rebuilding. Jazz clubs like his were part of that rebuilding. Spaces where former enemies mixed freely, where American soldiers danced with German girls, where music created common ground that politics had tried to destroy. It wasn't perfect. Old prejudices remained. But the music kept playing, and slowly, note by note, the walls came down. Friedrich lifted his trumpet one more time before heading home. He played a single note, clear, strong, free. It echoed off the buildings, drifted into the Munich night, and disappeared into silence. But the feeling remained. The feeling that had started in a Texas POW camp with a forbidden radio broadcast. The feeling that music could cross any border, survive any ban, and remind people that beneath all the divisions, they were fundamentally the same. Human beings seeking expression, connection, and freedom. And that feeling, more than any political ideology or national identity, was worth fighting for.